there, thank you, and thanks for sticking around to the end of the day. I guess it's probably a good place to start to talk a bit about what happened to Sony and to North Korea. I mean, if you were living in Iraq in December, you probably don't know that Sony was hacked, and by hacked I don't mean like some stuff was stolen. I mean pretty much everything they had was taken and made public. It was really a big deal. It was unreleased movies, it was private emails, it was employee data. I don't think we can even begin to count the number of lawsuits that are happening. And we actually don't know who did this. Near as we can tell, it was either a couple of guys in the basement somewhere or the government of North Korea. Which in itself should give you pause, because we're actually supposed to be able to tell the difference between a couple of guys and the government of North Korea. But it turns out that in cyberspace you actually can't. In the middle of December, North Korea itself was taken off the internet, either by another couple of guys in the basement or the government of the United States, neither of which have admitted to doing it. Some have speculated that somebody was using the landline, and that knocked the internet off. I mean, admittedly, there's not a lot of internet in North Korea to knock off. All of this leads me around to what I want to talk about, which is cyberwar and the nature of conflict in cyberspace. And this is a topic that has been talked about probably for about a decade now. A few years ago, I engaged in a debate. It was in Washington, D.C. It was the first time I ever did a formal debate. There were sides, there were rules, there was winning. And the proposition we were debating was, and this is a quote, "The risk of cyberwar has been grossly exaggerated." I was on the side of yes, and there are people on the side of no. I thought this would be easy, that I would just produce a list of gross exaggerations, we would all vote, and we would win. In fact, I lost that debate. It was kind of disturbing. And it really was in the months afterwards that I really started understanding what the issues are. Now, the hype is easy. I had quotes. Mike McConnell, he works for the government contractor Booz Allen Hamilton, used to be the head of the NSA. And he was actually the person on the other side of the debate with me. And he said in a newspaper article in 2010, "The United States is fighting a cyber war today and we are losing." Right? In 2010, this man thought the US was at war, which seems like an exaggeration if you ever heard one. I had great quotes for cyber war, for cyber armed Pearl Harbor, for cyber 9/11. My favorite was cyber Armageddon. I had a quote, this is from Australia, "Hackers declare cyber war on Australia." Right, again, right? It's hackers declaring war on a country. Right? Cyber war is so easy, even kids can do it. I had a quote from Amit Yaran. He was a United States cybersecurity advisor to President, which one? I think it was President Bush, because after Richard Clarke. And he wrote this in an op-ed, "Cyber 9/11 has happened over the last 10 years, but it's happened slowly so we don't see it." I don't even know what that means. Other newspaper headlines: Germany attacks China for starting the cyber war. Germany's at war with China. China declares war on Western search sites. You can declare war on companies now. Wall Street Journal, cyber blitz. This was in 2009. This was a previous attack against South Korea that was attributed to North Korea. Right, so we are seeing all of these exaggerations. After the Sony attacks, we saw tweets and headlines about how this was being an example of a cyber attack, a cyber war, that this in fact was a cyber war. And I saw op-eds say the United States lost this cyber war. I didn't even know we were playing. I mean, lots of examples that people give for cyber war. The most common one you'll hear is Estonia. Now, I'll talk about Estonia. This was April of 2007. And this was during a time of ethnic tensions between Russia and Estonia. And what happened is there were a series of denial of service attacks against political, economic, and media targets. At the time, this was blamed on Russia because, like, who else would do it? And it's a very weird type of war. Right? You have to imagine that the enemy army lands on your shores, and they all run in line in front of you at the post office. Right? And that's what happened. Right? People couldn't get at these sites because they were busy. A couple of years later, we had one conviction for these attacks, and there's a 22-year-old ethnic Russian living in Tallinn who was annoyed at a statue being pulled down, again showing that cyberwar was so easy, even kids can do it. Several years later, someone from a Moscow-based pro-Russian youth group said that he organized some of these cyber attacks. So a lot of this sort of ends up being kids playing politics. Also in 2007, this is in October, there was another type of cyber attack. And this was Israel versus Syria. And this is not Stuxnet, which I'll talk about in a second. This was Israel mounting a sneak air attack against a nuclear research facility in Syria. This was a conventional attack, right? Planes flying over a facility, dropping bombs that explode. With the cyber component of this was that the Israeli government was hacking the radar and other defense systems of Syria and other countries in the way or nearby to help disguise their attack and get in and out safely. So this is an example of a cyber attack that was part of a conventional attack. Now we're learning more recently that there were a lot of those sorts of things in both the first and second Gulf War. Also 2007, I'm going to stick with that year for a bit. Brazil was the victim of a series of blackouts. And at the time, there was the US news magazine, television news magazine 60 Minutes, did a large article on cyber war where they talked about this as an example of cyber war. The perpetrators seem either to be criminal extortionists, or there was a Wired article a few years later that blamed it on soot in the insulators. So again, we don't know. August 2008, a year later, in Georgia, Soviet Georgia, not the one that's here on this continent, there was an attack similar to what happened in Estonia. And unlike Estonia, where there were just ethnic tensions, in 2008 there were Russian tanks and troops rolled into Georgia. And precipitating that, there were a series of denial of service attacks similar to what happened in Estonia. Again, we don't know if it was the government of Russia or, like Estonia, it was kids playing politics. So when you think of these sort of variety of different stories, one of the problems we have, I think the biggest problem in that debate I had, is that we don't have a good definition of cyber war. Right? When does it start? What does it look like when it occurs? How do you know when it's over? Who can do it? Against what sort of targets? And it's not just newspaper headline writers. It's experts. It's military experts, academics don't have good definitions of these things. We don't have a good definition of what war in cyberspace means. Right? You know, in some respects, this is a rhetorical war. Right? It's clear that we're not fighting an actual war with China right now. Right? The US is not at war with China. NATO is not at war with China. So that makes this a rhetorical war, like the war on terror. And the problem with rhetorical, I don't know if it's true in Canada, but in America we have a really weird relationship to the word war. We hate using it when there's an actual war going on. Right? So we'll call the Korean War anything but a war. Or the invasion of Afghanistan, anything but a war. We're doing something else. But we love using the word war when there's no war going on. Right? War on crime, war on drugs, war on poverty. We love rhetorical war. The problem when you use something like cyber war, which has aspects of real military conflict and aspects of this rhetorical nature of war as being an important thing we spend a lot of money on, that you tend to get stuff tends to get mushed up. Right? So it's really dangerous to apply the term war when we don't really know what's going on. Now, what I think is, or at least part of what I think is going on, part of how to understand this, is not that we're fighting a cyber war. Right? Not that even if it was North Korea attacking Sony was an example of cyber war. Right? We're not fighting a cyber war, but we're increasingly seeing warlike tactics used in more general cyber conflicts. That's what's going on. And in some ways, that's a little scarier. And the neat thing about computers is they separate skill from capability. Right? Skill is encapsulated in software, and then anybody can do it. And this is true for a lot of things, and it's true for cyber attack. I mean, you don't need to have skill to launch a cyber attack, you just need the right hacker tools. And this is unlike a lot of other areas that we're used to. Right? We're used to being able to determine attackers by weaponry. And if we walked outside the hotel and saw a tank in the park out front, we would know that the, hopefully Canadian, military was involved, because only militaries can afford tanks. Right? We have this easy shorthand that you can tell the attacker by the weaponry. It doesn't work in cyberspace. All the attackers use the same tools, the same tactics, the same techniques. And you can't tell the difference. Which is really why we don't know who attacked Sony. There are lots of other examples. GhostNet. Actually, there's many of these. Every couple of years, maybe a year or so, we discover a large-scale, sophisticated surveillance network. GhostNet was the first one that really made the press in 2009. And this was discovered by researchers at the Munk School. I don't know which way it is, but Toronto way. And they discovered it when doing a security audit of the Dalai Lama's computers. And they followed the surveillance network back to a controller node and basically found that it was arrayed against political, economic, and media targets in 103 different countries. It was extremely well-designed piece of surveillance malware. Embassies, foreign ministries, government offices, some commercial, some media. And we believe China did it, not because China admitted it or there's some real evidence that it was China, but the list of targets was a who's who of who China wants to spy on. And that's a very common way we figure out who did it. Right? When last year, when we discovered Reagan, the list of targets had a big hole in the Five Eyes countries. And the Five Eyes are the, I don't know, this is I think it's an NSA term, but it's US, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, kind of the rich English language speaking countries club. And this is a very strong surveillance partnership. Right? Five Eyes, they don't dot them, they use it to stare at you. Right, so this is a surveillance network, Reagan, which was arrayed against a large number of targets all over the world, with the exception of those 5 countries. Right, so we can make a good guess of who it was. There was something discovered about a year before called the Mask. This was a surveillance network that seemed to be arrayed against targets in Latin and South America, Morocco, and Gibraltar. So who do we guess cares? Well, it's going to be Spain. And then there are bunches of these. There have been lots of attacks coming from China. Right? In 2010, Google pulled some services out of China because of attacks from that country. New York Times, 2012, the victim of a large attack on their email. Someone was trying to get the identities of Chinese dissidents. Last year, U.S. Attorney General Holder indicted 5 Chinese military officers for hacking U.S. not military networks but corporate networks. A lot of stuff is coming out of China. We're seeing examples of third-party hacking tools sold to governments. So there are companies, so basically cyber weapons arms manufacturers. Companies like Hacking Team, which is in Italy, and a couple in the UK whose names I forget. These countries have been selling both surveillance and attack software to many third world countries. Countries like Uzbekistan, Ethiopia, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia. Countries you might actually not want to have this stuff. And of course there's Stuxnet. Stuxnet is well worth looking up if you don't know the story. This was discovered in June of 2010. This is probably the first military-grade cyber weapon we've seen deployed. This was the US and Israel attacking Iran, attacking a nuclear power station in Iran. A very impressive worm designed specifically to cause a certain brand of centrifuge to break. And we believe it did, and actually did its job. So this is the kind of stuff that happens a lot. In some ways, this isn't new. I mean, there are stories from the 80s. In 1982, the US inserted malicious code into Canadian software that was being sent to Russia. So you guys were involved too. This software ended up on the Trans-Siberian pipeline, and the resultant explosion is still the largest non-nuclear explosion in world history. So hooray for us. 1991, during the first Gulf War, the US inserted malicious code into printers being sent to Iraq, and that in turn damaged their defense systems. That actually impresses me a lot, because in 1991, printers were really dumb, right, and barely networked. So this is the array of things that can happen. And the real problem is that our policy isn't designed to deal with this array of attacks and attackers. And so think of Sony. Sony's actually a good example. Right? When Sony is attacked, when anyone's attacked, they can call on a variety of different institutions to defend themselves. They can call on the police. They can call on the military. They can call on whoever does anti-terrorist security in whatever country you're in. They can call on a bunch of commercial products and services. They're corporate lawyers. And here's the thing of it. The legal framework in which any attack, and therefore any defense, operates depends on two things: who's attacking you and why. It's the same attack, whether it's a military matter or a police matter or an internal corporate matter, depends on who's attacking you and why. And in cyberspace, the very two things you don't know are who's attacking you and why. And guess what? You got 10 milliseconds to figure it out. But here we are 2 months later with Sony, and we still haven't figured it out. This makes defense difficult. This makes defense policy difficult. Lots of arguments in the United States right now about who's in charge of cyber defense. This is why there are arguments. This is why it's not a clean-cut case. Because at the moment of attack, you have no idea who should be in charge. And so what rules does our defense operate in? The military rules are way different than the police rules. And so you've got all sorts of adversaries, like spanning the range from like unsophisticated to more sophisticated. Think of hackers and criminals, some of these politically motivated attackers, spies, terrorists, militaries. Right? And they're all doing the same stuff. Right? They're all doing data theft. They're all doing eavesdropping. They're all doing data manipulation, denial of service, sabotage. And the clean lines are blurring. So like last week, I don't know if people noticed that the hacker group Anonymous announced that they were going to take out ISIS. Right? What? I'm reminded I think it was like 2010, Hacker Group Anonymous warned NATO not to mess with it, which was even more awesome. Right? Here we are, some ragtag hacker collective threatens NATO with like nuclear missiles. I mean, this is kind of normal now, even though it truly doesn't make a lot of sense. but it's the world we have to figure out how to make sense of, right? How to operate in. So a lot of this is what's been called advanced persistent threat. I don't know if people have heard that buzzword. Buzzword might be about a decade old. I started out hating it, and now I've come around a little bit. Now I think it describes something really important. Because we can characterize hackers along two axes, right? Think of skill and focus. And so your low skill, low focus attackers are your basic script kiddies. Right? People who don't have any skill are downloading attack tools and using them randomly. If you run a corporate network, you'll get thousands of attacks a day at this low level. I think of it as the background radiation of the internet. Right, high skill, low focus. That's a more zero-day exploits, identity thefts. Right, so more impressive attacks, more done academically as a demonstration, not really out to do particular damage. Low skill, high focus. Think of those as targeted attacks. In some ways, Sony was like that. It didn't take a lot of skill to break into Sony. Or the attacks against Target Corporation or Home Depot. And any of the sort of the big massive attacks we've seen in the past year or so. Right? You know, actually separate those two. Use Target and Home Depot. Right? Those were low focus attacks. It didn't really matter to the attackers who they hit. They just wanted a big block of credit card numbers. They happened to hit Target, they happened to hit Home Depot, because their security wasn't very good. The security was better, the attackers would have gone elsewhere. At Sony, the attackers wanted Sony. You know, with the North Korean government, we have a whole story about why they wanted it. If it's a disgruntled insider, it's another theory, we know why they wanted it. If it was a couple of random hackers, Sony's been a company hackers have loved to hate for about a decade. Right? Sony was the actual target. High skill, high focus, think of that as APT. And the thing about attack on the internet right now is that attackers have the advantage. If you know anybody who does penetration testing for a living, I mean somebody who actually does hacking for a illicit living, you know that a sufficiently skilled, funded, motivated attacker will never fail not to get in, right, period. They will always succeed. Attack is easier than defense. Right? And how do we deal with it? We're used to, in the industry, dealing with this relative security, with the Target Home Depot-like security. Now, we know we're not going to make you secure, but we're not going to make you the easiest target. The attackers will go elsewhere. That works great against financially motivated attackers. It works not that great against these politically motivated attackers. And politics is defined very, very broadly here. It's nationalistic, it's ethical, it's religious, it's against governments, against institutions, corporations, individuals. In the United States, we have seen several high-profile hacking against political candidates. And if you remember, in the last election cycle, Vice Presidential candidate Sarah Palin's email was hacked. The moral there is don't choose your high school as your backup password, especially when you live in Alaska where there aren't very many high schools. And so we are seeing, against companies, right? Companies everyone loves to hate. Right? Sony's example of that. So is Google. Right? It used to be Microsoft. Now it's more Google. And there's a lot of politics here. Right? On the defense side, we are seeing a lot of very strong politics around this notion of cyber war and cyber attack and government cyber offensive capabilities. Right? Just last week, in the wake of the terrorist attacks in Paris, the UK Prime Minister David Cameron announced that it shouldn't be possible for there to be communications that their government can't eavesdrop on. We had the Republican Speaker of the House in the United States a couple of days ago in the wake of that very weird plot about the guy who was probably entrapped to drive up to the Capitol and start shooting things. He actually said this, that if it wasn't for this broad NSA surveillance, they never would have uncovered that plot. I mean, forgetting completely that the plot was wholly discovered by an informant and had nothing to do with surveillance at all. But this is common, that we're seeing more and more pushes for government involvement in cyberspace, either on the eavesdropping level, being able to eavesdrop on broad swaths of the internet, which is done certainly by the Five Eyes, done by China, Russia, any other country that can try to get away with it. And on the cyber weapons side, we know there are about 24 countries on the planet that actually have cyber commands. I know the most about the U.S. Cyber Command. Canada has one. Where there are cyber warriors sitting at their cyber workstations doing their cyber stuff. I don't know, but I just know in the U.S. just recently, the U.S. military is trying to waive the fitness requirements for cyber warriors because it turns out that boot camp is incompatible with hacking skills. Surprising nobody except the U.S. military. Right? We know that North Korea has a very strong cyber offensive capability. That in fact, and you see this in the news, some people wonder, could North Korea actually have pulled this off? Yes. They have some very well-fed cyber warriors in their military. And so there's a lot of cyber war rhetoric going on. I mean, I remember reading a few years ago an article saying that U.S. Cyber Command is fully operational, whatever that actually means. And you'll see other countries saying similar things. Right, we're seeing power struggles in governments over who gets this cyber defense capability. Who gets the budget, who gets the power? Is it police, or is it military? In the U.S., is it the Department of Homeland Security, or the FBI, or DOD? Right, U.S. politics, we kind of know where things landed. U.S. Cyber Command is, the general in charge of U.S. Cyber Command is General Rogers, who happens to be the same general in charge of the NSA. And U.S. Cyber Command is located in Fort Meade, Maryland, where, guess what, the NSA is located. We've seen the inadvertently declassified Presidential Policy Directive 20, which talks about how U.S. wages cyber war. You can go look that up now. You couldn't, but Edward Snowden grabbed a copy for us, so we now can read it. There's power struggles between government and private enterprise. Right? In this world of critical infrastructure, in this world where a lot of our critical infrastructure is in private hands, whether it's the power grid or the communications infrastructure, how do you deal with nation-level attacks on it? And so it is the belief of the United States military, and I think that's 100% true, that if there was an actual war, China could drop the U.S. power grid pretty much immediately. And we could do the same thing to theirs. Now, how do we deal with that? Does that mean the U.S. should commandeer the power grid and defend it? Does that mean we should just accept that will happen? When these cyber attacks will happen in milliseconds, there's no time to change over from civilian to military control of infrastructure. So how do we deal with that? But you see that now in the debates inside the U.S. government about whether the NSA should actively defend the U.S. borders in cyberspace. Should they monitor all traffic coming into the U.S. for offensive packets? Does that make sense? Is it a good idea? Is it a smart idea? I mean, there's a lot of issues that we don't actually understand. Now we're seeing in a lot of countries, U.S. especially, convincing companies to make their systems eavesdropping ready. So in the United States in I think it was 1990, late, we had a law called CALEA, which stood for Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement, something that starts with an A. But basically the idea was that the US government, the FBI, previously would eavesdrop on phone calls by going to the phone exchange, going to the wires leading to your house, and putting alligator clips on them and headphones, and they would listen in on your phone calls. And that worked, so you got a warranty to do it. That started failing when the phone companies started moving to packet switch networks. That there weren't those exchanges, those analog exchanges where you could eavesdrop. And this annoyed the FBI, and they convinced Congress to pass a law requiring US phone manufacturers to make their phone switches eavesdropping capable, right? To change the architecture of the phones to allow for eavesdropping. Now, this did work for the FBI. Unfortunately, it made eavesdropping available to everybody else. So about a decade later in Greece, there was an enormous scandal when these same phone switches, which actually Greece didn't even need the eavesdropping capability, but it was in the software, so it was in the switches. That capability was turned on by someone we still don't know who, and lots of government officials were eavesdropped on. I mean, was it by organized crime, a rival political party, a rival government? We haven't a clue. But that same capability that was built to facilitate lawful eavesdropping, right, can just as easily facilitate unlawful eavesdropping. Right? There's no really way to write a piece of code that only works when it follows the law, because it's hard to code that. And we see that sort of thing again and again. And today, we're seeing the same arguments. Right? Late last year, FBI Director James Comey took Apple to task because it turns out that the Apple iPhone encryption is pretty good. And that annoyed the FBI. Right? But if it's pretty good against the FBI, it's pretty good against everything else. And the same is true for the encryption on your laptops, whether you run Apple and their BitLocker, BitLocker is Microsoft, Apple, I forget what theirs is called. Sorry, File Vault, right? And if you're running Linux, there are any number of third-party things you can turn on. And these are all perfectly good, strong encryption programs. I mean, this is encryption for your Android phones and also now for the iPhone. So we are seeing these debates being fueled by the UK just last week. That can we be allowed to build secure systems? Do we have to make them insecure at the behest of the local government, thereby leaving us insecure from every other government and every other hacker, individual, organized crime, whomever? Now we're seeing debates on data retention. And mostly in Europe, we're seeing strong data retention laws. I actually don't know what Canada does. But many countries have laws requiring ISPs to keep data on their users for 6 months, a year, 2 years, depending on the country, depending on the law. A couple of years ago, in the United States, there was a debate about an internet kill switch. This debate, the tech of this takes a variety of forms depending on who's talking about it. I always think about it as a big red button on Obama's desk. Right? Stop the internet. Now, that's interesting to think about. I'm not convinced that you could do it. Any one country could do it. If any one country could, the US could. So much of the infrastructure flows through the United States. It could strike an enormous blow to the entire internet just by closing its borders or by shutting down servers under its control. But right now, there exists no such button. Right now, you couldn't produce a button like that. You'd have to re-engineer the internet to make that button possible. And if you think about it, once you build the button, now you got to make sure that only the good guys can press it. And that's much harder than not having the button. You also see debates, and we've seen this since Sony, to make attribution easier. And one of the things that annoys a lot of people on the internet is that it's very hard to attribute where packets come from. Right? You know, when you get an email, you don't really know who it's from. All those headers can be spoofed. And in general, when a packet arrives at your computer's door, you have no idea where it came from. And you might be able to trace it back with some tools. You never actually know if it originated at what you think is the originating point. It could have originated further upstream. If you isolate it to a computer through some techniques, you don't know if that computer itself was hacked and is being controlled elsewhere. And there are various proposals to try to make attribution more robust on the net. These, technically are all doomed to failure. A whole bunch of reasons that you can't actually build in strong attribution. Actually, if nothing else, that link between keyboard and chair is very hard to bridge. And if you look up any good research anonymity, you see that you can always build an anonymous system on top of a fully attributable system, just through something like onion routing. Right? Somewhere where I build a system where you are all identified, but if you all secretly exchange messages and then send them out, I don't know which one of you sent it. Just know that one of you sent it. And that's even if I know exactly where every packet came from. And so these are the debates we're having. And they truly affect how the internet is going to be in the next 10 years. These debates, I believe, are fundamental to how the internet will work. Now, I don't want to minimize cyberwar. Certainly we need to be prepared for war in cyberspace. If we need a military, then we need a cyber command. Because any future war will include a cyberspace component. In the, I think, very unlikely event that US and China go to war, the odds are 0 that it won't include cyber weapons. Even today, US goes to war with Iraq, and there's quite a lot of cyber attack going on. We learned relatively recently that during at least the second Gulf War, the second Iraqi war, that the US basically controlled all of the Iraqi communications. It was able to listen to everything. And so this is going to happen. So these debates about who controls critical and dangerous infrastructure are important. Power, communication, transportation, chemical plants. How we provide security. We're seeing, I think there's really good writing now in the past probably 5-10 years in the military journals on trying to understand the characteristics of cyber war. The fundamental asymmetry of attack being easier than defense. The national asymmetry. Some countries come with natural defenses. You think about North Korea. They have almost no internet. There's not a lot of cyber attack we can do to them that makes any difference at all. Yet a lot of us Western countries are heavily dependent on the internet for quite a lot of our national infrastructure and are thereby a lot more vulnerable to cyber attacks. We are seeing work done on cyber war treaties. I think these are very important. To me, we are in the early years of a cyber war arms race. And so arms races are fueled by two things, right? Fear and ignorance. You don't know what the enemy has. You assume they have the worst, so you do even more. The enemy does the same, and it ratchets up. Treaties have a way of cutting through that. These are going to be very difficult. Think of how hard it was to enforce the chemical weapons treaty in Iraq, how easy it is to hide a chemical weapons plant. You could hide a cyber weapons plant, in a hotel room up there. It'd be much harder. But there still seems to be value in negotiating treaties, even if they are, in some ways, unenforceable. I think we need rules of engagement. It really is disturbing that armies have uniforms for a very important reason. So you know who the enemy is, and you know who the enemy isn't. Right? You know the difference between civilian and military. And this has been true for a whole bunch of centuries. that the rules of war dictate that armies wear uniforms, right? Tanks and vehicles and planes have flags painted on their tails, so we know where they come from. Now, this doesn't work. This didn't work for Stuxnet. I mean, it was years later when the U.S. kind of slowly admitted it was us. Or it's not working now for the attack against Sony, if it was North Korea. And this makes war different. This moves to a more guerrilla-style war, which doesn't really work for nation-state against nation-state. It works more in a failed state models, like Afghanistan was. We need to think about that. We need to think about commandeering. How does commandeering work in wartime? How do cyber mercenaries work? We're seeing a lot of cyber attacks being outsourced to third parties. And then this non-state actor business, right? Ranging from kids playing politics to terrorists. And everyone in between. And people notice last week that US CENTCOM, their Twitter feed was hacked by people claiming they were ISIS. Of course, this was completely misread in the media. You saw articles saying, right, U.S. military hacked. It was actually the U.S. military's Twitter account, and they didn't have like some magical military Twitter account. They had a regular, normal Twitter account. My guess was a phishing attack. Right? So it was a group Twitter account, so several people posted to it. I'm sure one of them got an email saying, "There's a problem with your account. Log in here." You click on the button, and someone stole your password. About 6 hours after the Twitter account was hacked, the U.S. CENTCOM's YouTube account was hacked. And my guess is the attacker said, "Let's try this password on YouTube. Let's see." I mean, that's one side of this. The other side is actual malicious attacks by non-nation state terrorist actors, which we haven't seen yet, but we might. Probably not soon, not at the point where they're doing enough damage, but it is the threat we have to worry about. So I think the cyberwar arms race metaphor is really valuable, because it does say what's going on. And it's US, China, Russia, a bunch of other Western countries. And there's a lot of fear here. There's an enormous amount of fear, especially when there is an actual attack. We are seeing attacks that have nothing to do with cyberspace being used to justify war in cyberspace. And that's, that is not new, and that's not going away. So I'm happy to take questions for the next 10 or so minutes. Thank you for listening. So in case you don't know, you're supposed to get in line in front of the microphone.
Hi, thanks for the talk. I was wondering, is there something that can be done regarding the increase of intensity and frequency of advanced persistent threat and DDoS, denial of service? Could a solution be increased education and less of a taboo, like making security less of a taboo?
I don't think there is any. Fundamentally, attack is easier than defense. There are a lot of things we can do around the edges, but I don't think we are going to change in the next 20 or so years the problem of attack being easier than defense. There's a whole bunch of reasons why it's so. And this changes over the millennia. Look at the history of warfare, it goes back and forth, but it's not going back anytime soon. So I don't think we can solve it. Right now, I am preaching more resilience than anything else, that instead of preventing these attacks, we need to know how to survive them. A lot of Sony was a real basket case when it came to what do we do now that we've been hacked. And I think there's a lot of improvements there that would have made a huge difference.
And about education and just...
I'm not a big fan of education, because education to me is... all right. That's not what I meant. I think when we say we need to educate the user, we're blaming the victim. And that good security will work even with an uneducated user. And that is a much better place to look than believe we can go outside this room, stay on the street, and start educating everybody. We're just not going to do that. There will be uneducated users. People will click on phishing emails if they're good That's the way it's going to go. Can we be secure even though they do that? Yes?
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It was really awesome. So in historical tangible war, let's say the invasion of Afghanistan, you have sides. You have US, you have Afghanistan. Now that's understandable. Where there begins to be a problem is with this issue of ambiguity. So when you have these wars that you like to attribute the word war to, so a war on drugs, who is the bad guy? Is it the drug dealers? Is it the drug users? When you have a war on terror, how do you define a terrorist? What is a terrorist? So how important is it to define a bad guy or an enemy, and will that in turn help the war in cyberspace?
Well, but sadly, we as a species are great at defining enemies. We know who the enemy is in the war on terror, right? We define it along religious lines. Bang, it's done. I mean, it's wrong, it's horrible, it's counterproductive, but that is what we're doing. I mean, the rhetoric of the United States is extraordinarily jingoistic, in this matter. So once you use the word war, you're right. You sort of force people to say, where are the sides? And you're gonna draw the line, I think, in a bad spot. And this is one of the reasons I really much prefer the police metaphor to terrorism than the war metaphor. Because police is not us versus them. Police is us versus, the one of us who's going around picking other people's pockets. And it's just a better metaphor. So yes, you're right. The war metaphor sort of forces you to decide on sides, which in a lot of cases is counterproductive.
And then what about sort of centralized networking systems? I believe it was a few years ago that Germany was considering creating a sort of centralized internet for the German country. Would that help or hinder?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, Russia's doing it right now. And it helps them because it allows them to spy on their citizens better. And so it goes two ways. If you trust your government to protect you, then a national data storage and services is valuable in some ways. I mean, you need to be connected. And no one's going to want to be on the German-only Facebook, right? Because your non-German friends aren't on it. I mean, so you have to deal with that kind of stuff. But it does depend. I mean, China forces its citizens to use national services. Why? Because they can monitor them better. They can censor them better. So in general, that kind of stuff's not good. But a country like Brazil wants to do it to evade NSA surveillance. Not sure it'll work, but that's their idea.
Hello. So since the Cold War, we have this thing called nuclear doctrine, where countries codify and make public the rules of engagement in case of a nuclear engagement. And I feel like that's interesting because it really shows that no country wants to be the first to hit. I'm wondering, do you foresee something like this emerging in cyber warfare?
I think it has to. Probably not anytime soon. I mean, right now, cyber war treaties are being blocked primarily by the United States. We believe we have an advantage in cyberspace. We have the NSA. We have all the cool stuff we're doing. And we believe we have an advantage. So we're taking advantage of that advantage by not trying to limit ourselves. I think that's going to fade probably within a decade. I mean, as we're learning more about China's capabilities, if nothing else. And so I believe, yes, there will be some codifications of when it's legal to wage cyber war, what it means, what are valid targets, what are valid retaliations, like you see in nuclear or chemical or biological. So yes, I do think that's coming, probably a decade away.
So the difficulty of attribution and the sort of ease of attack by individuals really sort of drastically changes the nature of conflict and warfare, like you've been describing. And typically in the past, if somebody attacks somebody else, it's very clear what happened, and there's usually strong consequences, and it's immediate and knowable and actionable. And I'm curious if you have any more thoughts on the sort of policy implications for relationships between nation states and how they would sort of treat this, and if it I guess compares to how sort of straightforward and clear these things have been for the entirety of human history.
Well, we don't know. I mean, and I think the whole North Korea Sony attack is a good example. Right? The United States government is adamant that it's North Korea. The FBI announced it with really crappy evidence. They came back and gave more, less mediocre but still not great evidence. I believe there is secret NSA evidence. Right, the NSA has been spying on North Korea since North Korea existed. Right, so, and you'd think we've gotten pretty good at it over the decades. So maybe we even have the initial sign-off memo on the program and the weekly PowerPoint presentations on the status. I mean, who knows? So, but that's not evidence we can release. So instead, we have very mealy, we think the FBI, the FBI says we think North Korea did it, and no one believes them. North Korea is not talking. Then North Korea gets knocked off the internet for a couple of days, and now the US isn't talking. Right? I mean, they were sort of deliberately cagey about it. My guess is that it wasn't the US. My guess is that it was either some hackers, because DDoSing North Korea isn't a big deal, or it was a coincidental North Korea outage because their internet actually isn't that reliable, and they have had outages. But we don't know. And you're right, this is very difficult. It makes foreign policy complicated, hard, and the fact that non-nation states have the same capabilities as nation states makes it even harder. So yeah, this is a new world, and we don't know what we're doing here. And the U.S. response was really sloppy. I was surprised. I mean, you'd think we would have wargamed this one, at least once, but it was a very ad hoc response, especially in the early days and early weeks, that it seemed like no one knew how to deal with this. I don't think it's going to get easier.
Thank you.
So I've really enjoyed listening to you talk about creating policy and everything and working on treaties, but war might not necessarily wait for that, right? And so if China has a kill switch for a power grid in the United States and something goes, with physical war we've had like conscription, you get the civilians involved, you register people. We're not prepared, we haven't said what we're going to do. What do you think if tomorrow a war started with an unknown enemy? What do you think we would do?
It's interesting, I don't know. I've been thinking a bit about that. We don't have conscription, but I guarantee you that the US government has been visiting, Google. Right? Because if we launch cyberwar, it's not going to launch them from Fort Huachuca, Arizona. We're going to launch them from Google, where we have the big network. So I think this notion of commandeering is something that hasn't been talked about, but I believe it's been talked about within governments. That US, UK, I mean, in China, in a sense, they really don't have the public-private split you have in the democracies. But in the democracies, I'm sure the conversations have been had. That if stuff really goes bad, Google, you're no longer doing search, right? You're doing something else.
Yeah.
I mean, just like during World War II, the U.S. went to Chrysler and said, stop building cars, start building tanks. Right? Because you have the steel, and we need the tanks. So I think that stuff will happen. But, I actually don't think there will be war, because I think that everybody who has the capabilities realizes that in some ways it's like nuclear war. That the attack is devastating, the defense is pretty much non-existent, and it would be messy all around if we tried this thing.
Awesome.
That's my guess. Hoping I'm right.
Yeah. Thank you.
But I tend to believe that globalization, world trade, is some of our best defense against war in general. The fact that China is buying so much in the United States means they won't bomb it, because they own it. Isn't China buying Toronto also? I mean,
town in BC.
Okay, see?
No, literally, they bought the streets, the buildings, everything.
Was it a nice town?
No, pretty small.
Small towns in BC are nice. Yes.
Hi. So it's the advent of the internet that allowed this new type of attack that allows anonymity and causes problems for the government and to say who did what and so forth. So in the context of at least financially motivated cyber warfare, what are your thoughts on where cryptocurrencies and crypto networks allow for anonymity in the financial transactions?
So what we've learned about, especially from the NSA documents, we've learned about cryptography and security is they do some things well and some things very poorly. And what cryptography does is it protects data in transit. It protects the networks. I mean, to me, the most surprising things about the NSA documents is they're not made of magic. I mean, you'd think with all of the money the United States spends on the NSA, they would have some magic. Turns out they kind of don't. They just do what normal people do with bigger budgets. And cryptography does give them trouble. And they solve it usually by routing around the cryptography, by attacking the endpoints, not the middle, attacking the servers, attacking the routers, attacking the computers. So what cryptography is doing is forcing the NSA to change its tactics to tactics that don't scale as well. And that's the value. There's a lot written of this, and I sort of, it's just near the end, and I can't really go too deep. But I sort of urge you to poke at my writings on this. It's really important to understand what crypto does and what it doesn't do. You're my last question.
Actually, that's all the time we have for questions.
That isn't even a question.
Sorry.
He's like the stop bit at the end of the queue. It's so, I mean, this is truly awesome. Thank you very much. Enjoy your evening and enjoy tomorrow.